To a non-Indigenous person, it may seem a common enough view of history. But Tony Abbott's description of Sydney before the arrival of the First Fleet is angering many Indigenous people, with some warning that it will damage their relationship with the government. Mr Abbott welcomed British Prime Minister David Cameron to Canberra today, ahead of their attendance at the G20 this weekend. Our political reporter Miles Morgan has more.
Tony Abbott plays tour guide for the British Prime Minister David Cameron. There's a lot of history here on the lands of the Eora Nation. The Prime Ministers saw the salt water, so important to the clans in Sydney. Across from the Opera House are the rocks. They were an important source of ochre for Indigenous people. But the Prime Minister says what is now Sydney wasn't much to look at 228 years ago.
It's hard to think that back in 1788 it was nothing but bush, and that the Marines and the convicts and the sailors that straggled off those 12 ships just a few hundred yards from where we are now must have thought they'd come almost to the moon. Everything would have been so strange. Everything would have seemed so extraordinarily basic and raw.
It's the second time Tony Abbott has seemingly forgotten the history of Indigenous people in Australia while talking up the benefits of British colonisation. Leaving Sydney, the two leaders then flew to Canberra, where David Cameron was given a ceremonial welcome from the Defence Force. He paid his respects at the Australian War Memorial. In Parliament, he acknowledged Australia's Indigenous past, saying progress has been made since colonisation.
I think of your Indigenous culture with roots stretching back millennia, and I feel pride that Aboriginal Australians are now studying at Oxford and Cambridge, and one of those scholars, Leela Smith, is here with us today. Let me acknowledge the original owners of this land, the Ngunnawal people, and pay my respects to their elders past and present.
The two leaders are making it clear they want to focus on infrastructure, foreign investment in Britain's economy and tackling the threat of Islamic extremists over the next few days. But Australia's Prime Minister may have clouded the focus with an impromptu history lesson for his British counterpart.
I hope as you pay your first visit to Sydney and you think of what your countrymen did 200 odd years back, you do feel a measure of pride and satisfaction at what has been achieved here in that time.
Miles Morgan, NITV News.
Tony Abbott's claim to be the Prime Minister for Indigenous Affairs has been tainted, according to First Nations leaders from around the country. They're dismayed and saddened by this morning's claim that there was nothing but bush when the First Fleet arrived. Nathan Moran from the Metropolitan Land Council, who represents the Sydney area, took the opportunity to set the record straight.
The fact is that in 1788 the land was populated by very advanced peoples, those peoples being the Eora Nation. The Sydney foreshore that he stood upon today was the Gadigal people, the clan of the Eora. At Botany Bay, when the First Fleet, well, the first arrivers from the British colony come and mapped the area, that was the Bidjigal clan people. They were all noted as being there, living good lives. In fact, were actually documented by Lachlan Macquarie as the most healthy race of people on the planet of the Earth when he arrived, which was the first official to actually rule the penal colony. So I feel very sad that Mr Abbott is coining history to suit himself.
Obviously, whoever in the Indigenous world is advising him will need to help send him back to school and correct his thinking and help him on the right path, because the current attitude he has is not going to deliver the reconciliation that we require, that many Australians require, nor the maturity of this nation in the way we'd like to see it in constitutional recognition.
This is a time where we need to consolidate the hard-won property rights that Aboriginal people have fought for, and these kinds of comments are unuseful and unhelpful in the context that Aboriginal people are trying to be part of the nation building.
I think there were some expectations, given his commitments in working very closely with Aboriginal people, as being the Prime Minister for Aboriginal people. I think that we can probably forget about that now.
I'd have to say that these are the sorts of comments that do quite a bit of damage to the relationship between our mob and the Prime Minister and the government, and I'd like to see him explain what he means by these things if he is able to.
Tony Abbott, as the Primary Minister for Indigenous Affairs, needs to sit down with the genuine Aboriginal political leadership needs to sit down with real Aboriginal people from across the communities and engage with us in a respectful and meaningful way.
Our birthplace, our songlines, comes from this country and from this land. No matter where you look at it, in the rivers, the hills, the valleys, it's all written there in ancient art.
A long history, long culture connection in our country. Kind of upsets you a little bit when you hear that, you know.
If that's coming from the Prime Minister, like what's the kids, you know, what are they learning in schools now, you know? It's terrible.
I think what it does is just indicate to us how far we haven't come as a nation and as a country. And we continue to promote the nature of our economic and social sophistication. But I think we're still very, very much a long way from any sense of real sophisticated maturity in the way we engage and deal with the First Peoples of this country.
I'd say it was a blunder, but this is becoming a habit. This is something like the third time the Prime Minister has made comments that insinuate that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people weren't here when this country was colonised by the British, and of course that is a furphy.
Very sad to hear Mr Abbott pushing outdated notions of racial superiority still today in 2014. But as a local custodians representative body for the area that he made the speech upon today, we say that he spoke through no fact or truth, but spoke for other reasons and benefits that supports the reason that we have no treaty in Australia in 2014, unlike every other remnant of the British outpost known as the British Empire, be it New Zealand, Canada, South Africa or America. So that's the parallel truth, Mr Abbott.
Well, this story triggered a flood of reaction online today after NITV posted the Prime Minister's comments on social media. Our online editor, Michelle Lovegrove, joins us now from the newsroom. And Michelle, this story really did blow up this morning.
Natalie, it did indeed blow up this morning after the Prime Minister delivered his speech to business leaders. NITV News posted the video of part of that speech on social media, and the results were extraordinary. Within an hour or so, we had thousands of shares and thousands of likes across Facebook in particular. Our colleagues at NITV and Living Black, who also shared on Facebook, experienced a similar deluge of reaction and result. Now, most of them were not kind. They certainly indicate the level of anger and the level of hurt at what was said today, or rather what wasn't said by the Prime Minister this morning. On Facebook, Bruce Jones acknowledges 1788 colonisation, but he says that settlement happened a long time before then. He says the continent Australia was inhabited, settled, nurtured and managed in 1788 and for 40,000 plus years before then. For Wendy Jennings, well, she grieves the messages that are being sent to our children and grandchildren. She says, Adam Goodes is absolutely right. Australians should know the real truth and our children accurately informed about our origins, starting with Tony Abbott. And she goes on to say, I would like to think that my grandchildren at least will receive a more accurate education about the caretakers of our beautiful country. We owe them that much. And for Eric Chilver, he says the beauty of a modern Sydney doesn't compare with an ancient land. He says Sydney's the last place I'd go in Australia. Australian colours of green trees, red sands and many colours of ochre, amazing sunsets, seas of blues and greens. Wherever I can, I bypass cities with at least a 60-kilometre radius. Give me the bush, the outback, anytime. I recognise the Aboriginal inhabitants of this wonderful land and their descendants now still alive and well. So, Natalie, that's just a small slice of the social media reaction. Do join me on Facebook, NITV News on Facebook. Go to NITV News in your search bar. And on Twitter, we are at NITV News. And feel free to follow us. Back to you, Nat.
Thank you, Michelle, with our social media roundup.